Hi there. Happy to be here to talk about how communication, relationships, and trust have all been part of collaborative conservation that has enabled ocelot reintroduction plans for private lands in Texas. I am here today from the East Foundation. We're a private landowner and an agricultural research organization in South Texas with a mission to promote the advancement of land stewardship. I've been working at East Foundation on ocelot conservation for about the last year, and I worked on this ocelot reintroduction project for about the 2 years prior to then as a master's student at Texas A&M. So glad to be telling this story and emphasize that I'm telling my perspective on how I think things went and recognize that others may see it differently. But before I do talk about all this great stuff with collaborative conservation for ocelots, I do want to give a little bit of the background and history into conservation for the species. So ocelots have been listed as a native federally endangered species in the US since 1982. Today, we only know of two breeding ocelot populations that are very small that are left in the United States. Both of them are found in very deep South Texas near the Gulf of Mexico. And we think there might be maybe only 100 ocelots left in Texas, but we're not exactly sure of that number. And that's because, over 95% of the lands in Texas are privately owned. Most of the remaining ocelot habitat and remaining ocelots are found on private lands, but most of the private landowners are not surveying for ocelots or allowing those surveys. So in addition to not really knowing exactly how many ocelots are left, we also, haven't necessarily made a lot of progress towards their recovery over 40 years. And part of that is probably because of the lack of collaboration between landowners and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And some of the collaborative conservation, that's needed for ocelots, it's things like preserving and connecting habitat, reintroducing a new population back into some of their historical but unoccupied range. And the ocelot recovery plan really recognizes for any of those actions to happen, it's going to be necessary to have pretty significant cooperation amongst different organizations, and really critically to get participation from private landowners who actually own occupied or unoccupied ocelot habitat. With that, though, the recovery plan points out to us that landowners have this anxiety over the implications of having endangered ocelots on their lands. That gets into concerns about Endangered Species Act regulations and how those may impact working land operations. And so those concerns do hinder cooperation from this group of stakeholders, things like not wanting to do ocelot surveys or covert ocelot conservation activities on private lands. So all in all, the recovery plan says that a focus on building relationships and trust between the Fish and Wildlife Service and landowners is necessary for ocelot recovery. And despite this being written up in the recovery plan, my understanding is that not a lot of relationship and trust building was really going on once this 2016 recovery plan was made. When there were attempts maybe to communicate across landowners and agencies, there was communication problems, maybe some discontent there. There's even public voicing of discontent across landowners and agencies. Just as an example, the first iteration of this documentary, American Ocelot, came out in the end of 2020. It had landowners and agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service, being interviewed, and the film kind of had a trading of shots between agencies and landowners voicing discontent with each other. And so much so that the filmmakers kind of perceived and told the ocelot story as one where we had these two opposing parties and we need them to come together on ocelot management methods. So I came into the ocelot conservation story in the beginning of 2021 as a field research technician, trying to help capture and collar ocelots, get them on camera, and starting to hear about some of the communications problems and the lack of collaboration between universities and landowners and the Fish and Wildlife Service, and hearing about some of maybe that discontent. And I've been really lucky over the last 3 or so years to have witnessed a transformation, I think, in ocelot conservation towards collaborative conservation. And so much so that despite all those historic and past challenges with landowner participation, we now actually have plans for ocelot reintroduction on private lands that's going to help the species recover, and that's also going to work for the landowners and for Fish and Wildlife Service too. And this ocelot reintroduction is being planned to occur on lands that are working. They're used for livestock production. They've got energy development interests. They're used for hunting. And really, we've been able to enable this private land conservation plan through collaboration and partnership, as well as the creation of a safe harbor agreement that addresses the regulatory concerns of private working landowners. And so what I want to do today is talk about this Recover Texas Ocelots project, this multi-organization effort to actually put together these plans for ocelot reintroduction. And specifically, I want to talk about some of the kind of key roles and personality types that I think are important, the team approach and the structure of our project, as well as the way that we did communicate in such a way that we were able to develop those relationships and that trust that ultimately led to private lands ocelot reintroduction plans. So first and foremost, I want to talk about 4 types of folks that I do think are important. And for us, those were sparks, connectors, leaders, and doers. So first are your sparks. Those are your visionaries, your risk takers, the folks who step up and call for a change to the status quo. And when you think about ocelot conservation, it had kind of been in inertia for 4 decades without a lot of progress towards recovery. And the idea of reintroduction, had been sitting on paper in the recovery plan for like 4 years with no actions to try to implement it. And so the East Foundation actually acted as the spark for ocelot reintroduction. East Foundation is the steward of some lands that are already occupied by some of the existing ocelots. And we have a goal of, in part to show that operation of a working ranch is compatible with endangered species conservation. East Foundation itself kind of had a spark in the summer of 2020 when Category 1 Hurricane Hannah hit South Texas, right where the remaining ocelot populations are. And I think East Foundation thought, oh my gosh, what if this had been a Category 5 storm? Would there even be ocelots left in Texas at all? So as a land steward, East Foundation started thinking, well, how can we use our other properties that are more inland in South Texas and our relationships with other landowners to maybe start expanding ocelot populations, spreading out that extinction risk, actually progressing towards recovery. And when you think about it, East Foundation is probably kind of an unlikely source for getting a species recovery project going. It's a private landowner, a member of the South Texas Property Rights Association, and not who you expect to be spearheading recovery. And I really think that there was just no way that the Fish and Wildlife Service could ignore this private landowner in South Texas saying, we want to plan a recommended recovery action. And so when I think about other projects, I think about who is that, maybe that spark who's so unique that they cannot be ignored for getting a project going. And maybe in a lot of cases, that is also going to be a landowner. When you have that spark, of course, they're important initially, but for us, in our CEO at East Foundation as a spark, he has also continued to really push for progress and enthusiasm throughout our process and has really been a sustained advocate of the project. And I think credit to the Fish and Wildlife Service for allowing East to be that spark and kind of that, advocate and driver of this process, but for the service to always be engaged and helpful and to really be there throughout to provide standards to make sure that this thing moves in the right direction. So you have this big idea, let's work on ocelot reintroduction. And from there, how are we going to actually operationalize that? And that is for us where our connectors came in. And for our project, connectors really came out of Texas A&M, and they were needed for organization, to try to take this idea and turn it into something we could work on through a tangible collaboration process. And the first step for establishing that process is really defining what the shared goals and the commitments are going to be of the collaborators. So for us, the goal is really to support ocelot recovery through reintroduction, and any collaborator needs to believe that reintroduction is a worthwhile effort to support recovery. Any collaborator on this project was going to be needed to commit to looking fully at the science and that policy or regulatory side of doing an ocelot reintroduction. I think most partners thought of it as planning the science and policy for ocelot reintroduction. Fish and Wildlife Service thought of it more as exploring those dimensions because they didn't want to be pre-decisional about this. And that regulatory side, of course, was really important to be committed to because we needed partners to be committed to protecting the interests of private landowners in concert with this potential ocelot reintroduction. It's Texas, most of the lands are private. Likely the reintroduction sites are going to be on or around private landowners, and they're going to have concerns about expanding the range of these endangered species, and those need to be addressed to earn tolerance and support for the project. And then finally, any collaborator involved in this, needed to be committed to doing it, not just as an exercise or as research, but in really creating a plan that could be acted on and implemented. So once these shared goals were created, it was then necessary to define the objectives within them and what teams are going to work on them and how this process is going to go. And at Texas A&M, we really outlined all of these elements and this process, on paper in a presentation that we explained to all the collaborators. And I think putting it up this way, really makes the process feel real and legitimate. And defining that process eliminates uncertainty on how things are going to proceed. So for our project, we had 4 objectives. We knew we were going to need to select a reintroduction site after doing some assessments. We were going to need to do population modeling to come up with a release or reintroduction strategy. We're going to need plants for breeding up the source stock, as well as actually reintroducing those animals to the wild. And then again, because this is Texas, likely to be on and around private lands, we would need to engage with a landowner assurance tool to protect landowner interests. So having these 4 objectives, we then decided that we wanted to have a team centered around meeting each objective. So a geospatial team would do the site assessment, a modeling team, captive propagation team to create our breeding and reintroduction protocols, and then a policy team to integrate all that other information into a regulatory, assurance tool or document. And then we also established a leadership team to sort of oversee everything and make some key decisions along the way. Knowing we were going to have these teams working on these different objectives, we also knew we were going to need some facilitation to organize things, set up meetings and agendas for the teams, help them work through their objectives, communicate across the different teams. And this is really where I came in. I was a student facilitator on this project. And with me, I was new to Texas. Nobody had ever worked with me before, had any biases against me. So everyone was pretty open to working with me. And further, because I was young and a student and excited about this, everybody, I think, kind of wanted to root for me and help me out. And we even framed this project as my master's thesis. So people really wanted to support me in that, I would say. And so I do think that it can be important to have a neutral person as that facilitator, someone who folks maybe haven't worked with against and couldn't have biases against, so that they can be that facilitator. And of course, the facilitator, that coordinator doesn't have to just be in that role only. I grew to do a lot more for this project. So we had the different objectives, knew we were going to need teams to fill them out. And then we defined all these different organizations as the stakeholders, those who are involved in Ocelot conservation already, have the expertise that could help with this project. And once we knew the organizations, it was a matter of deciding who are the individual folks out of here who can sit on these different teams and be collaborators on this project. And we really leaned on organizational and agency leadership to help decide on the individual folks who are going to be involved in this. And so it was really important from leadership to give some thoughtful appointees to be part of this. We needed folks who were going to be collaborative, not likely to be creating interpersonal conflict, and to be ones who are, interested and supportive of this project. And in some cases, for organizations, this kind of meant maybe moving on from some of the usual suspects, people who had worked on Ocelot conservation before, but maybe weren't going to be the greatest collaborators on this project. In addition to getting people appointed to be part of the project, high-level leadership, really especially at the Fish and Wildlife Service, has been huge for our project. The regional level for Fish and Wildlife, there is support for the project, and agency staff, really top down has been directive to be supportive of the project, to be highly engaged, to make it not just a side project, but really a priority for the agency. And so having these folks who are going to be appointed to work on the project and make it a priority, those appointees are kind of what I would call the doers. These are the ones putting the hammer to the nail, sitting on these teams and actually completing the objectives. And they're doing so, being organized by those connectors. They've got the direction from their leadership, and they've got the inspiration from those spark folks. One thing that I think was important on each of our teams is that we tried to really maximize the representation of the different partner organizations and really try to have each organization have some ownership over the objective of that team. And so creating that shared responsibility and that shared ownership, I think was really important, that we avoided kind of this idea where maybe just the university and East Foundation groups were going to be completing objectives and pitching things out to the Fish and Wildlife Service to just approve or deny. Working together created more buy-in over all of these objectives. And in addition to that, I do think that just working all together allowed us to leverage, of course, the expertise, the time and capacity, and the resources of many organizations, and accomplish more and better work together than we could have on our own. We did things like work all together on assessing possible reintroduction sites and on writing our safe harbor agreement. So from here, I've talked about kind of what our process was going to look like a little bit, some of the key people that we needed to involve, and want to turn now to the communication side. And, remember that just having all these organizations kind of bought into those goals and ideas of using Ocelot reintroduction to support recovery and working on it all together is exciting and something that hadn't been seen really before for ocelots. So right away, we had this momentum and we wanted to continue it, and communications were important for that. One of the first things I think is important from our communications is that we wanted them to really be, direct, all together, and in structured meetings with note taking, rather than having sort of non-structured or non-inclusive communications that could risk creating some confusion or some maybe distrust. And I recognize that from time to time, leadership folks might need to have side conversations to push each other forward or get on the same page. But I really do believe that forcing everybody to bring the communications into these team meetings in front of everybody was really good for opening up our communications and important for building that trust. So in terms of how we did communicate, we would have monthly meetings for each of our different teams. I'd send out an agenda for the meeting, we would meet, and I would take notes during that, send out those notes after, talk about follow-up actions, have extra meetings as we needed them. And I think that just having all the teams talk consistently every single month, it meant that things never sort of were left open-ended without a plan to follow up and continue on. And we never risked this project fizzling out. I also want to emphasize that our partners here, they're spread across Texas and really across the Southwest and the country. And we did all of our meetings on Zoom. We did not wait for a quarterly or an annual in-person meeting to, work on the objectives, to talk and to share updates. We were doing it every single month, at least for each team through these meetings. So I do think it's important not to let that distance and that virtual environment be a barrier to not, talking together, working together, starting to get to know each other and seeing each other as teammates. And I do believe that the consistency of communication, even if it's just occurring on Zoom, you can't help but get to know each other a little bit and build a little bit of a team spirit by working together so much and communicating. With that, our collaboration being new and being mostly virtual, there were some awkwardness, sometimes, and some challenges that we faced. There maybe was some sentiments at times that East Foundation was trying to move too fast here, maybe not being very deliberative. And maybe a view that the Fish and Wildlife Service was being slow. It was being so wary about being pre-decisional is that it was inhibiting progress. More concretely, we had moments where, can we decide on a reintroduction site and move along in the project? What's going to be the genetic makeup of the reintroduced cats? Where does reintroduction sit within the overall recovery plan? And I think that just because we had the collaboration infrastructure set up, it was being facilitated. We had some developing relationships, support from leadership, and all had this commitment to a shared goal. The challenging moments never stopped folks from continuing on, showing up to the next meeting, being ready to work. Nobody ever quit on this partnership. One thing that did help us about a year in is that we reminded ourselves of our shared goals and shared commitment to each other through this project paper. I include a link there because I think it might maybe be a good example, and I'll show that link again later. But we wrote this up and had a leadership person from each organization sign on to, again, just reiterate the commitment to working on Ocelot reintroduction all together, despite some of the uncertainties and the challenges that were going to be there. And I think all in all, the key is kind of that although you could have these little disagreements or challenges along the way, having a commitment to working together on a big goal and having that North Star of working towards recovery really helps keep you together. So I did say that I think the consistent Zoom communications and the high engagement did help start developing some personal relationships and that team spirit. With that, though, we did have some in-person times in Texas, and I think that really helped develop personal relationships. It also helped, out-of-state folks just see this as real and be in the real place where things are happening. And, I think what could be a better show of trust than inviting your partners to come spend time on your ranch or in your workplace and spending the day with each other, or, being that out-of-state partner who's willing to travel across the country and spend time with the folks in the field. And we really ultimately found, that teams that are consistently communicating with each other and working together, they learn to trust each other. They trust each other's commitments to working together on shared goals. And when you have the trust, you're able to listen to each other and accept recommendations from each other, maybe when that even changes the plan. As an example for us, when this project got going, there was this idea that maybe the University and East Foundation folks were going to ghostwrite this 10J proposal that the Fish and Wildlife Service would then put out for the reintroduction of an experimental ocelot population. And a little ways into the partnership, Fish and Wildlife Service really shared, a safe harbor agreement would be a better fit for this situation, a more straightforward process. It would be better to do that than 10J. And East Foundation, because it had been working with the Fish and Wildlife, had some developing relationships, it was open to this suggestion and it took it. And we worked on a safe harbor instead of a 10J, and we did it really collaboratively with Fish and Wildlife Service folks. And I think we probably saved ourselves time and effort by doing it that way. So all of this was kind of how we have operated within this Ocelot reintroduction project. And I do want to emphasize just some of the outcomes that are coming out of our collaborative conservation. So first and foremost, we of course have this programmatic safe harbor agreement for Ocelot reintroduction onto East Foundation lands, which are working lands surrounded by all other private working lands. And so we have allowed Ocelot reintroduction to happen on private lands while keeping those lands working. We've addressed landowner regulatory concerns, and we've shown the use of a landowner assurance tool. We also now are constructing an ocelot conservation facility in South Texas. And when that is ready in 2025, we'll be implementing the partners' plans to breed ocelots, to behaviorally prepare them for life in the wild, and then actually get them reintroduced out to our reintroduction site. A huge development in our partnership has been the award of a multi-million-dollar contract from the Fish and Wildlife Service to the field partners to support several years of research, of captive propagation, and of reintroduction. And I think it's just a huge show that the Fish and Wildlife Service is committed to the Ocelot project. They also have trust in the partners that we can receive these funds and use them effectively for ocelot conservation. And then finally, there's a lot of existing and ongoing ocelot research in South Texas that's been going on. And all of the communication and the collaboration that's going on surrounding the reintroduction project is really helping with these efforts, because some of the old, disagreements or communication problems can be fixed now. We don't get into issues, with maybe field seasons or permits, thanks to all the collaboration we've got going. So all in all, I think our model is a good one of proactive, voluntary, multi-organization, collaborative conservation to plan endangered species projects on lands that are privately owned by folks who have concerns about the regulatory impacts of those endangered species and acknowledging their presence on their lands. So if I had to go to some of the keys from our ocelot conservation without conflict story, I think there's these 4 types of folks who are important for the process. You've got to have your sparks that get things going, start a process, but are also there throughout to really keep it moving forward. I think if a spark can come from an unlikely source, that holds a whole lot of weight with the agencies who are really needed to support the Sparks throughout and guide them along some standards. We needed connectors in our project to bring everybody together in this tangible, facilitated collaboration process centered around our shared goals and really in communicating together in facilitated ways. Leaders have been very important to us for giving us good collaborators to be involved on this project and for really creating top to bottom support, commitment, and engagement in this Ocelot project. For our doers, those folks have worked collaboratively across organizations. They really have this shared responsibility in completing the objectives, which gives every organization some ownership over there. And it really helps us get beyond this idea of just being a proposal group and an agency approval group, but being all together. In our project, I would say we had pretty consistent, pretty structured communications, and that high engagement through the communications, it helped us get our work done, but also create some relationships and grow that trust in each other and each other's commitment to working on Ocelot recovery. We found that teams that communicate a lot with each other and learn to trust each other, they can work through challenges and they can take each other's advice. And then finally, we've seen for ocelots that just once you have collaborative conservation going, the effects just spill over positively into all sorts of other areas where you might be working together. So I'll recognize again the different partner organizations that are involved in this organization and our website. Have a look at the project paper if you're interested in that. And also really want to shout out my graduate advisor and the director of the Texas A&M Natural Resources Institute, Dr. Roel Lopez, who really kind of designed this collaboration from the beginning. Thank you so much.